Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming again to this cycle of talk dedicated to the UNESCO Convention for Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage. Today, we have the great opportunity to have with us Mrs. Cristina Biasetto. She is the focal point for intangible cultural heritage of the Austrian Commission for UNESCO. Thank you very much, Cristina, for being with us today, and I give to you the floor for your talk dedicated to the intangible cultural heritage in your country. Thank you, Cristina.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pierluigi, for inviting me to talk a little bit about the 2003 Convention and its ratification and legal sphere in Austria. So today's presentation will be structured along following three key points. First is the ratification process of the 2003 Convention. The second is the safeguarding and legal anchorage of ICH in Austria. And the third is the national inventorying process of elements of ICH. So I start with this talk to assume a little bit that you have some knowledge of the 2003 Convention, its contents and goals, and would like to go immediately into medias res. I will only mention this. So after the Convention for Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage was adopted in 2003 by the UNESCO General Conference, it started a new international consideration of what cultural heritage entails throughout the world. It also started this reflection process in Austria and here we post the immediate question, so what is considered Austrian intangible cultural heritage? So a few years after the convention was adopted, the Austrian ministry in charge of culture at the time commissioned a survey which intended to find out what was generally perceived as living heritage. So results showed in the ALIA that ICH was mainly associated to those traditions which were considered to be prestigious and representative for the country. So, for example, the Spanish horse riding school. It also became apparent that practices considered as ICH were mostly connected to the first three of the five thematic areas as defined by the convention, which are oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, as they were associated with music traditions and festive events. Areas 4 and 5, traditional craftsmanship and knowledge about nature and the universe, have previously not necessarily been linked or thought as a part of the Austrian cultural heritage. By wanting to emphasize the importance and to show that there is a vast variety and diversity of ICH beyond the first three thematic areas, influenced the decision of the Austrian Parliament to ratify the convention. In 2006, the Federal Ministry for Culture established a focal point for the ICH within the already existing Austrian Commission for UNESCO to accompany the ratification process. In 2009, Austria officially signed the convention, and the National Commission has ever since been entrusted with the administrative coordination and implementation involving inventory making, awareness raising, and safeguarding, transmitting, and promoting ICH in Austria. So the official introduction of the 2003 convention pushed the process on the reflection and rethinking on a national level of what cultural heritage entails even stronger, and has drawn public attention to the significance of ICH in areas that were not considered part of it before. So, for example, in health politics, when we look at elements like traditional medicine, or in forestry management, when we think about elements like avalanche risk management, as well as knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, like agricultural practices, for example, transhumance, just to state some examples. This brought a cultural heritage to the attention of a variety of new public and private stakeholders, from the agricultural sector to the economic sector, as well to the health sector, just to name a few. But what did the ratification of the convention change on a level of policymakers in order to enable the safeguarding of ICH, which is the center of the 2003 convention? We know that practitioners, bearers, and communities are the main responsibles in safeguarding their ICH in different ways they seem appropriate. But the main question is now, how does the state enable this safeguarding? And what legal instruments can the communities rely on that maybe does not guarantee but support their safeguarding efforts? To answer this very complex question, we will want to take a look at the general structure of how responsibilities of culture/cultural heritage in Austria are divided. We look specifically at culture now, first because ICH is often connected to the field of culture or in the responsibility of ministries of culture, and secondly because, well, culture is already in the word of ICH. We have to look at two competency levels here. At the level of the federal states, as well as those of the 9 Austrian provinces. Why? Because Austria is a federal state with relatively independent federal provinces called Bundesländer, which means they have certain independence in policy making in certain areas. And second, because the general clause of Article 15 of the Constitutional Law of Austria allots the main responsibility over the sphere of culture to the province. So to help understand where different and overlapping responsibilities are, you have a short overview on the PowerPoint presentation, but just to sum up some key points. So state authorities are responsible for cultural policy on a federal level that focuses on issues of cultural diversity and cultural provision, things like federal museums and national libraries, international cultural cooperation, financial support for cultural activities, etc., etc. For federal provinces or authorities are responsible for providing support in terms of content and funding for cultural activities, promotion of cultural activities, and heritage, tradition, and folk art. Following this division, cultural heritage appears to be mostly in the legal competencies of the 9 provincial governments and their cultural promotion acts that are concerned with legal safeguarding measures for intangible cultural heritage. Consequently, it is mostly the federal provinces that are responsible for creating an environment where ICH can be safeguarded, as their respective promotion acts and cultural programs allow the creation of legal and/or social framework that favors safeguarding activities. We can observe that since the ratification, 13 years ago, legal actions and measures in the federal provinces have been taken to favor the safeguarding of ICH. Laws have been, for example, adapted or created that try to support the viability of elements or a specific element. For example, in Austria, all events in public spaces with a bigger audience need to be registered and are met with a series of criteria and bureaucratic requirements. However, the Act on Events of the Federal Province of Carinthia states that events that are historically grounded in folk customs by their nature, especially those included in the National Inventory of Intangible Cultural Heritage, are excluded from this mandatory registration. This means forms of ICH may take place without previous authorization and meet less bureaucratic and administrative challenges. Besides this example, when we look at the programs and promotion acts of the 9 provinces, we can find further examples and references made that state an explicit commitment and support to safeguarding of ICH through, for example, financial support of safeguarding measures for the elements, while in other provinces we can hardly find any reference to ICH, mostly guidelines and regulations that state a more general commitment in supporting the safeguarding of different forms of cultural expressions, but only few cultural programs or legal frameworks, like the one mentioned in Carinthia, specifically use the term of ICH or refer to the Convention of 2003. However, it would be also wrong to say that there are no legal guidelines or frameworks that support safeguarding, even though ICH is not mentioned explicitly. All provinces have a duty and a legal framework to support different cultural expressions, whether they are referred to as ICH or not. But it remains in their competencies to define what is seen as intangible cultural heritage and what is not, especially when cultural expressions are not mentioned or listed in the national inventory. Furthermore, certain elements of ICH have to look outside of the sphere of culture to search for a legal framework that supports them, especially if we consider elements that relate to the thematic areas 4 and 5. If you look at the practice currently listed in the Austrian National Inventory, for examples, in these two areas, you will find many entries that are regulated and are supported by legal frameworks in the area of agriculture, water rights, environmental laws, economic laws, and so on. An example would be, for instance, the element of bird catching in the Salzkammergut, which is a custom that has been practiced for centuries in small parts of the federal province of Upper Austria. In 2010, the practice of bird catching was included in the national inventory. Outside of the Austrian Salzkammergut, bird catching is prohibited. However, due to its long tradition in the region, an exception was made in this specific area that is stated in the Upper Austrian Nature and Landscape Conservation Act to enable communities to continue the practice. So, taken from this example of bird catching, we have also to look outside of this cultural sphere for supportive guidelines and regulations for different practices of ICH, which includes those in the competencies of ministerial bodies. To give a complete overview in responsibilities for different elements and practices is an impossible task that touches for each element several spheres and responsibilities. To make, however, a concrete example, let's look at the element of the transhumance. This element, which entails the seasonal driving of livestock, has been inscribed in the National Inventory in 2010, as well as the representative list of ICH in 2019. Most legal and financial support for the safeguarding of the practice are mentioned in federal agricultural law, independently of its inclusion as an element of ICH, but also structured by regulations of the European Parliament and the Council of Rural Development. In addition to this, singular cultural and safeguarding activities like traveling exhibitions that were and are still organized by the communities are supported by cultural promotion acts of federal provinces where the transhumance is taking place. So also, if we take a look at this at the level of a federal state, living heritage is a terminology not mentioned frequently in policies, laws, and decrees. Public entities of the federal state have, however, undertaken various efforts to enable and enhance promotion and safeguarding activities for singular elements of ICH and ICH in general. Cultural strategies and funding opportunities offered by ministries have been important steps in this regard, and especially the ministry in charge of culture plays an important role when it comes to safeguarding ICH in Austria, as bearers and practitioners can apply for funding and grants for projects, safeguarding measures, and in general, and can rely on the Cultural Promotion Act that provides a legal framework for these funding opportunities. Besides the financial support, ministerial bodies and provincial governments have actively engaged in the creation and dissemination of knowledge around ICH and its promotion on a national and international level by raising awareness on topic and setting safeguarding measures themselves. One such example would be the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, which has created a training program called Forestry and Culture, together with the Austrian Forestry Association. The training course aims to make greater use of the cultural potential of the forestry environment. It also wants to show that living heritage can contribute to the sustainable development of natural areas. The training also highlights the interrelationship between cultural practices and the natural environment to which they belong to. Especially this last example shows how ratification and the promotion of the Convention over the last 13 years has created a wider understanding of cultural heritage in various areas and fields and expanded the comprehension of ICH and its need for safeguarding. However, as per now, as you might have figured, there are no overarching laws and guidelines on how the state and federal provinces must, should, or can create or facilitate safeguarding actions and support for ICH. Though committed to the convention, each federal province takes its own action as well as the federal state to support and enhance different forms of cultural expressions. On this note, I want to showcase an example of what can happen if policymakers don't consider practices of ICH in their safeguarding requirements when drawing up laws and guidelines, and how this can affect the sustainable development of living heritage practices. To underline the statement with evidence, I want to refer to a study which was conducted on Austrian traditional craftsmanship in 2014, which was initiated by the Austrian Commission as in cooperation with the Austrian Economic Chamber. The study showed that some legal changes and regulations slowed down rather than supported the viability of elements in the field of traditional craftsmanship. The research survey in general focused on traditional craftsmanship as an economic factor in Austria and intended to highlight the cultural and economic potentials of traditional craftsmanship, its innovative capacities, and the importance that craftsmanship forms as a basis of people and regions' livelihoods. During the research, artisans stated repeatedly in interviews that many regulations that came over time and were implemented locally, nationally, made it more and more difficult for small scale practitioners to stay financially afloat while practicing their craft. The rising financial burdens, increased bureaucracy, compliance with various norms and inspections can hardly be borne anymore by some small scaled workshops and artisans and hampers their development. To showcase the importance of how these traditional crafts not only form a livelihood for people, but also constitute an important form of living heritage that needs to be safeguarded, such studies and other awareness raising activities are crucial in order for decision makers to make these elements present in a state party and bring the requirement of these practitioners and elements to their attention. One proven way in which to raise this awareness is surely the inscription of these elements on the national inventory related to the 2003 convention. So, as many of you know, the convention requires state parties to draw up in a manner geared to its own situation one or more inventories of the intangible cultural heritage present in their territory, to quote Article 11. But it does not state how. For this reason, every state party has adopted a slightly different approach. Austria started its inventorying process in 2009 after the ratification of the convention and established a process that includes practitioners and bearers, people representing governing bodies, as well as experts from civil society. More specific, groups, communities, and sometimes individuals are invited to apply for inscription on the list. They have to fill in a form and send it to the Austrian Commission for UNESCO. Questions that the communities have to answer include the viability of the element and their current safeguarding measures and so on. They have to assess current risk factors and strategies for a long-term safeguarding of the element. The application must further include two letters of recommendation by experts that are relating to the field of the element. An advisory body consisting of representatives from five federal ministries, from the 9 cultural departments of Austria's provincial government, as well as 10 scientific experts from the fields of cultural, social, and natural sciences, decide over the inclusion on the inventory of the element. They base their evaluation on a set of criteria that refer to the definition of ICH in the convention, as well as to the international lists and other additions that have been made over the years. For example, some of these further requirements for the elements of ICH in Austria are: the element has to be transmitted across at least 3 generations and is still practiced, so which means it is not revived. The element is not misused for political, economic purposes and is in accordance with existing laws, and just to name some. The inscription process, you will find a really short overview on the PowerPoint. And this is not a finished process, but an ongoing process. The National Inventory currently lists 157 elements and is published online in the print version in English and in German, and you will find also a link and the reference on the PowerPoint. The process of inscription takes some time, takes over several months, and is quite lengthy. And you might ask yourself, well, what is the benefit of being listed in the national inventory for communities, considering also that it does not apply any financial support or further legal protection? A survey between communities representing these elements on the inventory showed that very different results. So for some, the inscription had no effect on the element itself, on the practicing of the element. For some, it even had a negative impact in the sense that the attention it got through the inventory caused also over tourism in some cases, which need to be addressed in later on. But for some, we have examples that they also can have a positive effect. So in one of these positive effects I want to tell you now, which is for the element called Stinatswedding, has been inscribed in the National Inventory in 2020. It consists of wedding practices from Croatian minority in the province of Burgenland that combines orally transmitted traditions such as dialect and folk songs with traditional handicraft techniques like production of local wedding costumes. However, the practice of the wedding and knowledge surrounding it has a little bit declined over the past years, and bearers and practitioners were trying to get support in their safeguarding efforts. Through their inscription and recognition as part of the Austrian intangible cultural heritage, they were noticed by decision makers and were granted further financial support in their safeguarding activities such as research and documentation. This is just one positive example that the inscription on the national inventory can have. Looking back at the last years, and generally speaking, about the 2003 convention, we had seen a great impact in Austria on various levels. First, on the level of stakeholders, surely one is an increased recognition and appreciation of the diversity of cultural expressions existence that are not only linked to the sphere of culture, but the ratification had an even bigger impact on the bearers and practitioners of ICH that feel seen in their efforts and knowledges that they continuously adapt, live, and pass on to future generations. However, in order to safeguard living heritage, there needs to be a continuous engagement both from the community side as well as from the public and private entities that have to make a constant effort, a continuous effort to create an environment that supports these communities in their activities. And with this, I come to the end of my presentation about one little aspect about this big topic in Austria, that is the intangible cultural heritage. We can look back together at 20 years of the convention and the big worldwide impact it had, and look also forward to the next 20 years and the impact it will have. I thank again my colleague, Mr. Pierluigi Petrillo, for giving me the opportunity to speak a little bit about it. If you have any questions, you will find my contact information at the end of the PowerPoint, and feel free to reach out anytime.
Thank you very much, dear Cristina, for your very clear and interesting presentation. I think that at the end of this talk, everybody can understand in a better way how in your country is managed the intangible cultural heritage. So thank you very much, and we will see you on the next talk.